Okay, so maybe then what I'll do is I'll just start with what is OQLIS and what does it do and why do we exist? So primarily OQLIS is an analytics tool where it's sort of a cloud offering or a web-based offering. But essentially what we do is, at our core, is that we help people make better decisions through data visualization, business intelligence, automation, and machine learning. That's essentially our the core of what we do. And we've taken a bit of a different approach in terms of other traditional BI vendors, in that, we've allowed the ability to connect directly to databases and analyze the data sort of where it lives and try and make the process from going from data to dashboard as simple as and intuitive as possible. So essentially that's the core of what we do, and primarily our customers and our main focus is usually software vendors like yourselves that have developed a sort of a world-class application, and they're gathering data through the application sort of all day and every day. And then always a customer asks, well, I want to see the reports of this, or I want to see what this looks like over time. And when people have spent so much time actually getting the application right and sort of the business process of what they're doing, the reporting always tends to be an oversight. So typically our customers then would use OQLIS, build the dashboards inside of OQLIS, and actually embed that inside of their application so they can give their customer a seamless experience of using their application to fulfill their particular or solve their particular business problem that their application solves, and then they get the experience of the analytics and dashboards inside the application, all as if it was one application or all in one place. And typically, if you want to allow the customer to deep dive further into their data, it's always a little bit difficult then to give them direct access to the database and all those things. So basically through OQLIS, you can enable the customer to slice and dice their own stuff if they actually know what they're doing. So that's typically what we do, our particular customer niche that we solving. And so that's a little bit of the background of what we do. So in this particular session, it's going to be a technical session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deep dive into some of the mechanics of how OQLIS works, how you'd go about building a dashboard, how you'd go about exploring your data, a couple of tips and tricks and nifty features. And then I'll show an example of how you typically go about embedding a particular dashboard, and then all the different sort of mechanisms that you can use to basically, when you're embedding the dashboard, send through filters, do a bit of funky stuff that usually sort of happens with different customer requests. So yeah, in saying that, are you guys ready? And I'll just jump into the actual UI and sort of take you through all the detail. So basically what you're looking at here is the OQLIS homepage. So we've got a couple of different concepts that we do to help make the analytical process a little bit more simpler and a little bit more organized, or hopefully a lot more organized. So we've got this concept of spaces, which is essentially, you can think of it like folders or workspaces, where you can separate your different types of analysis into different areas. And it's nice to basically just organize the dashboards into logical places and all the little chart widgets into logical places. So you can go back and refer to a specific space and access all the things you need. So typically what we see is that businesses tend to create spaces based on either like a use case or like a department or like a functional area. So you might create a space that says HR or finance or sales, depending on basically how you want to segment that information. And what that allows you to do is, if you're in the UI, you can control access to those spaces. So for instance, if you're only in an HR department, and you can have an HR role, the only space you would be able to see is that HR space and all the information inside of that. So typically, that's sort of the first concept to understand, just in terms of the organizational structure of these things. So in your language, it'll be similar to like a process group or some sort of logical methodology as to how you group different things together. And then following spaces, the flow in terms of getting actually data into the system is that we've got basically connections is the first step. Then the second step is data models, which I'll dive into. The third step is what we call explore, which is essentially the canvas to build your visualizations on. And then you've got the dashboards where all those visualizations actually live. And there are some other elements on the menu item that I'll dive into at a later stage. But essentially, those are the core concepts just to grasp right now is connections, data models, explore, and dashboards. And it follows like a sequential process, is that you can't have a data model without first creating your connection, and you can't have an explore without first creating your data model, and you can't add to a dashboard before you've built your explore. So that's typically the process somebody would follow inside OQLIS. So in following that process, basically what I'm going to do is show you each one of these steps. So in this example, I've clicked on the connections tab, and we can see a whole bunch of connections created over here. And the connection I'm going to focus on is just the one we've recently created. We've actually got some processware data that we can use to slice and dice and work through these examples. So typically how this would work is you'd do a deployment of OQLIS on a customer. I know basically you guys do on-premise installation, so OQLIS can work on-premise as well. So what you do is you'd deploy OQLIS on even the same Microsoft server environment as where processware runs. And then what you do is you go ahead and you'd add a new connection. And that would be as simple as creating a direct SQL connection. And what you can do is that this user can be a read-only user if you want to make sure that there can be no data manipulation. But basically, you'd specify a name, the server IP address, the port, the database, a username, and a password. You'd hit test. It would test that can successfully authenticate, and then you add that connection. So that connection then becomes an object for you to essentially build your data models on top of. So that's a relatively straightforward process. Similarly, how you'd set up, for instance, like SQL Management Studio or any sort of DB connection tool, very sort of typical about how you do that. So now that we've created our connection object, what you can call it, the next step in utilizing this connection is building a data model. So this might be a little bit different to, for instance, the way ClickView does their data models. How we view data models, you can think about it conceptually as a view. That's the most simple way to understand what we're doing. So a SQL view. So typically what you do is if you wanted to create a new data model, we'd go ahead and add a new data model. We'll pick our connection, which is processware OQLIS. And basically what's going to happen in the background is that we're going to go ahead and try grab the schema of that particular database. And that just allows me to sort of, if I've forgotten what a table is called or what a view is called, it helps me quickly reference that. But what's happening in this particular screen is essentially a SQL-like environment. So basically the idea here is you say select star from, and the particular view or table I'm going to look at is OQLIS _ event hist. So that's basically the sum total of how easy it is to create a data model in OQLIS. So it gets a little bit more complex than that, in that if you want to add additional formatting options, you can either do that on the view itself or on the table itself in the source, or you can dynamically put it inside of this data model. So for instance, you might have a date, is in the wrong format. So you might want to cast it to a different type, or you might want to, for instance, concatenate basically event name with, let's say, final use or something like that. And then we can call this as new, as a new column. And then SQL Server is concat, eh? So that would be a typical example of how we do additional formatting inside of the data model that might not be present in the view or table that we are actually doing. So typically what we usually do in this is all the date formatting options. So, aggregating to the closest month, or formatting to the closest month or the closest day, if that's not in the view already, or concatenating first name with last name if it's not stored in a table like that. So you can either do that in the view or table itself, or do that inside of this data model interface.
Andrew, I should confirm, but nothing in your data model is actually persisted. These are live queries all
Absolutely, yes. So that's a great point, Dennis. So this isn't persisted. So we do a result set cache for a specific amount of time that somebody can set, but we don't transport that data in its raw form. So that's where we differentiate from ClickView, in that the ClickView SQL scripts that you would put actually transport that raw data into their cube environment where they do their funky magic there, where we don't persist it outside, and we're relying on the performance of the SQL Server to actually underpin the performance of the dashboard.
Okay. So, and a quick question, is this able to execute stored procedures?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So basically there's a little stored procedure setting over here. So basically how you do that is you'd say exec and you say USP underscore my procedure, and then also we can cater for parameters, dynamic parameters, if you want to sort of send that through. But basically then you'd say, yes, this is in fact a stored procedure. And what we would do our side from a technical perspective is that our code executes the stored procedure on the SQL Server. We then take that result set. We then make that result set available as you can think of it as a big select union of the result set, which we then aggregate over. So it sounds a little bit complicated, but we execute the stored procedure. That result set is essentially available within like a sub-select, and then you can aggregate over that stored procedure. So typically how that would work in practice is that you might decide you want a stored procedure for every little widget on the dashboard, or you want a stored procedure that essentially builds that view or that result set for you, and then you want the dashboard to essentially aggregate through different dimensions on top of that stored procedure. All right, so so this covers essentially the data model aspect. It's a relatively simple concept, although it's sometimes a little bit different to what people are used to. So you can think of then what's happening in here is OQLIS is essentially almost creating a view on a view in a way. So it's sort of treating this query as an object then to sort of aggregate on top of. And that's essentially the purpose of what this data model is that you normalizing the data in a way that allows you to pivot and aggregate across different dimensions dynamically afterward. So typically what you want to have inside of your data model is all your hierarchical information, all your date hierarchical information if you can, and any like custom logic that you want to implement. So a lot of what we do, in particular in, for instance, the IoT space, guys want to know, well, what's my latest record? And what we do from the data model perspective is then we do, for instance, like a left join on the same table, and then we left join on the max time and the max ID or the max key, and then we use a case when statement to essentially create a new column that allows me to, from a binary perspective, understand, well, what's the latest entry. So we use a lot of data model logic to essentially create sort of columns of variables that we can use for filtering later on. So typically what we can also do is, and I'll get to the visualization aspect, is we did an example recently of where guys are tracking whether lights are on or off across a particular region, and they wanted to view that in a Google map. So what we do is then we can render a marker, a custom marker on a Google map in a particular longitude and latitude. And depending on whether the light was on or off, we rendered a different marker or a different icon. So then you can visually see which light is on or off. And then the way that we did that is we controlled that through the data model that says case when state equals on, then the URL of that particular marker. So that's a very, very nifty way to essentially bring a lot of custom styling elements and sort of these different HTML elements that I'll get into as well, that allow your dashboard and your visualizations to be that much more sort of usable and attractive. And I'll get to some of those different examples. Cool. Yeah, so typically how that would look is like case when event name, something like this, equals new, then 1, else 0, end. You know, so then like you can essentially use that as a filter that says, well, when my column new equals 1, then I'm referencing all event name new, if that's sort of what I want to do. But obviously this logic can be as complicated as you want to do. And that might be logic that I might not want to hold in the view itself on the database. I might want to sort of have abstractions on top of that. But that's essentially as simple as the data model gets, but it can get quite complicated if you wanted to. And then typically what you do is you'd assign access levels to that data model. So how this would work in the normal scenario is if somebody was wanting to explore their own data, and I'll get into the detail of what explore means to us, but essentially slice and dice the data. If, for instance, they want to slice and dice their data, but only can see HR information, you can create dynamic roles within OQLIS and assign those roles to people and data models so that when they go to explore data, they only see the data models that their role has access to. So that's the way that we control access to these data models, is through different access levels, where a person in this scenario is either an admin or a viewer, but you can dynamically create roles, for instance, per department or per different functional area, and assign access privileges to this data model. But that's if somebody's physically interfacing with OQLIS itself. In the embedded scenario, that access level doesn't necessarily flow through from that point unless you are essentially sending through the username, and then we've got a pre-filter set up our side that essentially pre-filters the row level data, which I can get to at a later stage. But that's conceptually how data models work, and a little bit of what you can do, and some of the nuance around that as well. So if we sort of comfortable with that, I'll jump into the explore screen, and I'll sort of deep dive into that. Is everybody okay so far?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So this explore screen is where the magic happens. So you can think of this as like building a pivot in Excel, or if you've worked in Tableau, sort of Power BI, somewhat similar, but essentially what you're doing here is you picking the data model that you want to now interact with, and then you're basically going to drag and drop across the canvas and switch out your visualizations and do all your necessary stuff that you want to do. So what I'm going to do is I've got a process overview data model that I just select. And now what that's doing is in the back end, it's creating a query. It says, okay, get me the first record of this data model, and then categorize that record according to whether it's a number or a string. And that's basically how it's separating between measure elements, and grouping dimensions. That's as simple as it gets. So these are all the columns that I've exposed within my data model. And if I've done a select star from a particular view, it's essentially got all the columns in the view. That's what's happening on the left-hand side over here. So these are all the things that I can slice and dice by. So typically how this would work is that, say, I want to know, okay, well, how many records do we have? So the simple way to do that is, well, give me a count of process instance ID. And it's going to go ahead and run that query for me. And what I did there is I just said, okay, show me this as a single value KPI. So I'm going to deep dive into all the different visualizations, but essentially all the different visualizations are sort of marked with these little icons under this visualization tab over here. So typically each one of these visualizations have different, they've got different options, but also they've got different amounts that you can add grouping elements to. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a bar chart, you can split a bar chart a couple of ways. You can split it in the axes. You can, in the x-axis, you can then split it by x-axis and color. And then you can split it by x-axis, color, and individual chart sort of across the canvas. So essentially, like, there's only 3 ways to really split a bar chart. But if you want to view the raw data, you can essentially have an infinite amount of group by elements because you're just viewing it at the detail. And I'll sort of explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So typically, for instance, if I want to know, well, what is the count of process instance ID and show me per year? So because I've dragged across year into my grouping element, there's nothing stopping me putting a measure inside of a grouping element, and there's nothing stopping me dragging a grouping element into a measure element. It's just typically you'd want to bring numbers in here and text fields or grouping elements in there. But in this scenario, because year is an integer, it thinks it could be a measure, but it can be a group too. So because I haven't changed the visualization, it's drawn a single value KPI across the different years. So it's basically just split it. But if I wanted to view that as a chart, which is the default thing that pops up if you wanted to start from new, this is essentially what the chart's going to look like. And now what I mentioned before is that, you can only split the chart a certain amount of ways. Is that, for instance, I want to know, for instance, in my different months, I want to now split this by a color. So for instance, I can drag in month over here, and let me pop it in there. And now what this is going to do is it's going to split it by month and year, where the year is the different color and the month is the x-axis. So that's what I mean by sort of splitting it by x-axis and color. But then if I want to go a little bit further, I can split it a little bit more. And if I want to, say, split it per chart, what this is going to do is now going to render the different chart for every unique split of process group description. But obviously you can see then it makes the canvas a little bit too busy, but then there's a couple of options I can use to control this. But that's typically one of the key things to know when building a visualization, is to understand what visualization you're trying to use, and also the maximum amount of grouping elements that make sense for that visualization. So typically, if I wanted to view this as a pie chart, as an example, a pie chart essentially only has one dimension, which is now my different months. But if I want to bring a year in there, let's just see if this now splits it. Yeah, then that split isn't so lacquer there. So essentially what this says is that, okay, cool, well, I've only got one dimension that really makes sense for this particular split. But what I can do is add, for instance, an inner ring into this pie. Let's see if this actually does that. An inner ring inside the pie. So I can have my common axis, essentially what you can call it, and then I can have my different measures that sit inside of this pie if I want to split it like that. obviously average year doesn't necessarily make sense, but I'm just sort of demonstrating the concept of what you can do for the different visualizations. So what I also mean by sort of infinite amount when viewing the data, if you wanted to view the raw data as a data grid, what we call it, you can essentially drag any element into here. So, you know, I might have that, I might have that, and bring that in there. Okay, and then that's typically, if you wanted to view the raw data, you could essentially split a data grid by any dimension. So that's a little bit about how that works, or just the conceptual ideas around measures and groups. But this should be relatively familiar to everybody. If you've ever built a pivot in Excel, it's not that strange. But then I'm going to sort of deep dive into the different visualizations. We got bar gauges. So what we do with a bar gauge is that we calculate the maximum value for each of these different splitting dimensions, and then that forms the maximum value of the subsequent bar. So it's nice to view sort of data in relative terms. So we can see this is the most or the busiest, therefore it's sort of green. And then there's a whole bunch of options that allow you to control this particular visualization. So for instance, let us use, I can reverse the colors if I want to. I can have 3 gauges per line if I want. I can then change this to, for instance, like Rand if I wanted to, or add any of my custom elements there. I can add a custom color gradient that's going to happen across this particular thing. So there's a whole lot of sort of deep dive options for each different visualization that that once you sort of get your hands on this, you can sort of go and experiment with. Then in terms of other gauges, there's sort of more sort of dashboardy gauges, or more sort of like auto style gauges that you can do. And that's sort of quite common for something that you want to do. And then if you want to view the raw data, you can do that by just clicking the data tab over here. And there's a whole bunch of options around that. You can enable filtering that allows people to pick certain things. So it's sort of like an Excel-like experience. And then also what you can do is that you can build a pivot over the data, like a UI pivot over the data, which is for people that might want to sort of really slice and dice something, but within a dashboard, not necessarily in the exploration canvas. So I'll give you a good example of how this would work is, say, for instance, I want to bring in year, month, and process group description. I can then go ahead and say, okay, cool, well, using that information as my raw data, let's go ahead and build our pivot. So I can say, okay, cool, I want to view process instance ID as the data field. I want to now group it in the columns like this, and I want to view it by year and month in my row fields. And essentially what I've done here is I've built a pivot grid in the actual UI of the tool. So basically it's using the raw data that I've specified in my grouping elements and my measuring elements, and I've essentially re-aggregated on top of that information. And there's quite a lot of options in terms of this pivot, and there's also options that allow you to dynamically color these pivot cells based on its underlying value. So for instance, if you're measuring things as a percentage of 100 and you want to know in a pivot, well, bring back sort of values close to 100 is green and values under 50 is red. You could essentially do that through these options and dynamically color this pivot, which looks quite interesting. I might have an example that I can show you on that, but that's one of the things you can do with a pivot. And then typically, let's get in month over here. A couple of other options. There's spark lines, and those traditionally are used for more like simple visualizations. So you might have like a dashboard with a single value KPI, and underneath it like a quick little summary over time. So a sparkline is essentially just a summarized chart. And then obviously we get the normal chart that we have over here. And within this chart is a whole bunch of options too. So you might not like bar, you might like line, you might want area, and then you can go ahead and customize these to your heart's content to really get the sort of visualization that you're looking for. You can hide the legend, show the legend, give it a title, change the palette, do custom styling to the x-axis, custom styling to the y-axis. So basically build and customize these charts, really the way you want to. And then there's a whole host of options that allow you to get you sort of exactly what you want. So when sort of navigating through the data, like the best way to do it is actually through drilling down. And that's traditionally sort of like very hard to do, or to sort of program, or to have sort of like some sort of like custom programmed thing, how you drill down. So what we've tried to do is make the drill down process, or how you set up a drill down, as easy as possible. So in an example, I might go from year, but I want to now actually drill down to the particular months inside a year. So what you can do is you can say, okay, we'll take month, and I'm going to drag it into my drill path. What that is now doing is it's telling the system, listen, when I double click on 2016, go into 2016 and then split it by the dimension I've just specified in my drill path. And that becomes really powerful, because essentially you can then build all your hierarchy of how you want your data journey to work. So like you might say, well, go from this process group description into this process, into this event, into this user. So it's a very nice way to go from high level chart, drill all the way in, and then get to sort of like a core element that's an outlier. And what's nice about that is, as you do that, if you drill in on a dashboard, the whole dashboard reacts to those filters. So basically, if you combine visualizations together and you drill down, each one of those other visualizations will filter, and then you'll view that different perspective while you're maintaining those filters. And I'll work through a nice example of that, and when we set up a dashboard. So basically what you'll see is that on every page of the app, there's this little help icon, and that help icon is context aware. So basically, depending on what page you're on, it's going to show you help for that page. So basically, show me help for this page. Because I'm on the explore page, this is going to show me a bit of a write-up about what's happening, all the different videos that we've got, and then a little bit more sort of write-up on those different things. So it's like quick and easy to access this information, and you want a bit of a refresher, or know, oh, single value KPI with HTML. Wow, what's that about?
Yeah. And
sort of go into that and see it. So that's the best I can do in terms of.
That's perfect. That's yeah.
So I think let's move on. So what I'll do is now I'll build a dashboard, but I'll keep referring to different visualizations, and maybe what we'll do is we'll build a dashboard with different visualizations that will essentially cover the elements anyway. So let me do this. So I've got now my grouping elements by year. What I want to do is I want to organize it or sort it by year. So I just want to ascending, and let's see what we got over here. Okay, that looks great. So now what I want to do is I actually want to save this. So I'm going to just save it in my processware space, because that's, I haven't got a specific area I might want to save this. I'm just going to save it in there, and I'm going to say this is number of, I think this is the process overview, which I think has the event detail. So basically this is the count is number of events by year. I'm not giving it a name. I'm not saving it. And then what I can do is, because I've saved it, I can now create a new dashboard directly from this interface. I can now call it, let's call it technical session dashboard. And because I'm saying create new dashboard, what it's going to do is it's going to create the new dashboard and add this visualization to the dashboard. So right now I've got my visualization I've just created. I can now drag it, resize it. I can resize it sort of top, bottom right and bottom left. I can drag this around across the canvas if I want to. And also what I've seen right now is that I kept my x-axis month, but I actually grouped it by year, which is incorrect. So I can actually rework this over here. I can put my title year, and then my y-axis I can make it a little bit more descriptive. I can basically count of events or number of events. I can now save this. So when you embed this dashboard, those elements of customizing this dashboard aren't available. And also, if you're just a viewer user, you cannot change the options of this. Basically, then you as the builder of this dashboard can maintain the integrity of how everything is set up. So what I'm doing and I'm showing you is more of like an admin or like a builder perspective. When I dive into how you actually physically embed this, you'll see that these options then disappear because when you're viewing it embedded, you can't change any of it. So what we've got over here is, because we've got our visualization and I've dragged in my drill path, that drill path is available for me to use. And basically what you've seen is I've double clicked on my particular year. What that's done is it's applied what we call a sticky filter. That sticky filter allows us to interact with different chart elements at the same time. And when I do another example or add another visualization, you'll see what I mean. But basically what we have here is I've drilled in. I can now see the breadcrumb of where I've gone. I've gone from my home level into my month level. And then I've got a couple of options here. I can drill up. At any point, I can see what I'm actually filtering by. I can also see my filtering over here that this is 2014. But if I want to now do something a little bit different, I will now drill into my month level, but I actually want to remove the filter that I've actually got there from. I can remove my sticky filter. And what you see happening there is the chart changing. So what that is essentially doing is it's keeping me at my monthly level, but removing the fact that I got there through 2014. So this is now essentially a monthly level over all the years. So it's a bit of a weird concept to wrap your head around, but those are the things you can do. So when I combine a different visualization, you can see how that can be quite powerful. So to get back, I just went home, or for instance, I can just drill up if I want to as well. And that takes me up a level. What I can do is if I add multiple levels, I can actually navigate dynamically through it. So let's add day over here, and then let's add process description, group description. I can add that into my drill path, resave this, go back to my dashboard, and now I've just added 3 different levels of drill. So I can go into my year, into my month, into my day, and into my process description. So I've gone all the way from high level into my lowest level row level. So what I'm going to do in building out this dashboard, I'll show you how you can use another nifty trick of what we've done is that when you're on this lowest level, what we have the ability to do is show another chart when you're on that lowest level. And what that allows you to do is typically when people have a summary view, then they ask you, oh, where's the detail? And then when they see a detail view, then they're like, oh, where's the summary?
Yeah.
So how we've addressed that is that you can hide the detail behind the summary. So what I mean by that is when you're on this lower level, say for instance, I want to know my purchase requisition process in 2012, in the fifth month, on the 17th day for process requisition, what is the detail? When you double click on this, because you're at your lowest level drill, you can pop up another chart, which can be a grid that then shows you the detail. And I'll do that specific example right now. So let's do that. So I can now click on the heading, and the heading just allows me to do is just to quickly go back into the visualization. But what I can do is then use this and then save it as. So I can just use this as a template. So I might want to now view this as in the detail, and I might want my event name, event description, date activated. Oops, my sorting is missing, so that's telling me I've got an error. So let's remove that. And then let's see the final, let's see originating user. That might be interesting. And then there we go. So now basically I can save this as a new one, and I'm going to call this event detail. Save as new. Now what I don't need to do, I don't need to add it to that dashboard, because what I'm going to do is when I go into my technical session dashboard, I can now tell this chart in my drill and filter settings, show me the detail when I'm on my lowest level drill. And now I save this, and what you'll see, what will happen is when I've gone 2012, 5th month, 17th day, process requisition, what it's doing is it's now bringing me the detail for that entire drill path that I've gone down. And I can now see all the detail of that happening. So it's a nice way to hide like the specific row level detail behind summary KPIs if I want to. So it's a bit of a nifty feature that like just adds a bit more like usability to sort of getting somebody to this detail. And also what I can do is if I want to now allow, for instance, that data grid to be exported, I can actually then say, well, let me set some options for this data grid that allow me to export. Because then everybody's like, oh, how do I export this to Excel? You know, that's pretty much what everybody does. So then if you enable exporting and you save this, then if you're on your dashboard, you can go almost to like a particular scenario, get to that point, and then bring up your grid and say, okay, cool, you know, you want all the data for this, okay, click that, and then export all data. And then boom, you know, like I've got that data exported for that particular scenario. So then everybody's not like, oh, well, you know, give me a data dump of the entire table. So it's just a bit of a nifty trick how to do that. And then also in terms of this drill level, you can go then any level up. So for instance, say you don't want to go all the way back up, you might go back to month, just in a different, you know, like switch between the hierarchy, and then go home and then close that sticky filter if I wanted.
And then Andrew, when you now activated that data grid, how do
Yes.
you search within there for further information?
Sure. Okay. So perfect. Now that's a great question. So basically, there's a couple of advanced options in terms of that data grid that are nice to use. So obviously at the default, it's like the basic data grid, but there's a whole thing. Let's enable filters. Let's allow resizing. Let's allow reordering. Grouping panel, filter row. So there's a whole bunch of options now that I've enabled that when I save, allow me to get to that or have that additional experience. So using our same example over here, so now that I've got my data grid up, I've got then all these options. So I might want to filter by an event, like show me that event. Okay, cool. Show me this event description. Okay, cool. And then sort by date activated and show me originating user where it's them. Okay, cool. And then also like if I want to like group it through some mechanism, I can do that if I wanted to. And it just allows me to sort of group a little bit and reorganize how this looks. So there's sort of ways that you can interact with this data in a sort of an Excel-like way.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I just have a quick question. Okay, so you showed us now on the dashboard that there's one model, but could you
Yes.
like multiple models on that dashboard, and could the
Yes.
other models be influenced by the selection that you made in, like, say,
Yes.
the dashboard?
Absolutely. No, so I'll do an example like that. So yes, that's true. You can do that. There's only one caveat, is that the columns that are present in the data model that you want to interact with, they have to be present. So you might have, for instance, a data model that's calculated at one level and one that's calculated at another level. But for instance, if you want to filter by process group or click process group or year or something like that, that column has to be present for you to cross interact with it. So it doesn't need to be the same model, but the columns need to be, the column that you actually want to reference needs to be the same. So an example of that would be, for instance, if I've got, I think, let's just check if we've got a table like that, but we've got event hist, event instances, and then we've got, I don't know if these are at different levels, but essentially you can, as long as the column's the same. So this is referencing event instances. So let me quickly create a new data model that just demonstrates the concept. Select star from OQLIS _ event hist. Okay, so let's just make sure it runs and we've got everything we need. So we've got quite similar columns. We've got year, month, originating user, process description, so generally the same, but it's a totally different data model. Process overview, let's call this detail, not that it is, it may be. But then if I wanted to now do a little bit more things on here, so let's use the process overview detail and take event instance ID, count it, and then for instance have originating user. So to see who's doing the most, I can call this event detail per user. Save it there. Add it to the dashboard. Now what you'll see is that if I don't apply or I don't tell this particular dashboard to have that behavior, it's not going to cross filter. So for instance, my drill here is now independent from this chart. You see, it's not reacting in any meaningful way, because these are two distinct data models, and this chart doesn't know yet that it must listen to what's happening over here. So the way that you control that is through an option that says apply other data model filters. Basically save that. Now when I refresh this, when I click 2016, this will now react, but it only reacts correctly because year is present both in this data model and this data model. And then similarly, if I go to the detail over here and I say month 8 exists within this data model as well. And then what will not happen is that if I click this chart is not listening to what's happening over here, because I haven't told the chart on the left to listen to what's happening to other data models. So right now, this is the only chart that's listening to what's happening on the left-hand side. So that this one's not updating this one. And you also see how it created a different color for that sticky filter. So this is just referencing that this is happening on one data model, this is happening on another data model. That's sort of how we differentiate what's happening. But that's, I mean, essentially what you can do to let two charts listen to each other. The only caveat is that the columns are the same, or the columns that you want to filter are the same, or the same name. That's essentially what's happening.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I think what I'm going to do is then I'm going to make this dashboard pretty. Like that's what we're going to do in the last little bit, and then I'll give you a sort of a quick example of how you embed this. So typically when we help customers build dashboards or advise them to what they should be doing, the best advice I can give is that You want to start with higher level metrics, and then as the dashboard progresses, you want to get to lower and lower detail. And what I mean by that is, we've tended to find a particular formula that, like, I personally like, is that you've got a row of single value KPIs that are telling you what's happening, and then you've got like a view over time or a bar chart that's telling you a little bit more detail, and then further to that you've got a little bit more, and then maybe the last step is a data grid that gives you some real detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a single value KPI that's going to give me a sense of how many processes there are, how many distinct instances of a process there are. So let's do that. So basically, let's go, I'm going to call this total number of events. And this is a single value KPI. And I'm going to save as new because I've used an existing one to work as a template. And I've now added this to a dashboard. So you can add an explore to a dashboard directly in the explore screen, or you can hit this little plus button, and basically it brings up all the different explores that you've created that allow you to just add it quickly to the UI. So you can either do it in a specific instance of that explore, or you can, in your dashboard, just add an element to it. If you've, say, created 10 different ones, and you want to just add them quickly. So what's cool about the single value KPI is that I can add a whole lot of HTML styling elements that make it pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump into like our demo instance, because I'm just going to grab an example of just like a quick copy and paste of what we've done. So what you can do is that this single value KPI has got a whole lot of options, but one of the options is the ability to add HTML to the UI. So some of you might be comfortable with sort of HTML, some of you it might be a bit strange, but essentially what's happening here is that this is just an image tag, and you're basically controlling the styling elements of that tag, and basically I'm just referencing a specific URL, and I'm just giving it a width and a height, and it's basically putting that icon on the UI for me. So I can build a dashboard that has all these pretty icons. You can sort of add GIFs or sort of anything that you want to do that just sort of make these icons a little bit sort of more visually appealing. And one of the things you can also do is, if, for instance, you don't want the title to be displayed, total number of events, or for instance, you want to center it, just make it a little bit more bold and prominent, you can basically change that the way that heading looks, so it sort of looks a lot more sort of KPI-ish, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to now take total events. Now I want to count distinct users. So I want to know how many users are actually doing anything. So distinct count, let's get a distinct count of users that are happening, 412. Total number of users. Save as new. Add it directly to my dashboard. Rearrange my dashboard. I can change my icon if I want to. Change the title settings. Center 16700. Let's go average duration. This might be a big number. Okay, it looks like a SQL error converting to data type int. So there's something funky happening on the actual duration calculation there. So let's not do that. Let's go distinct events. Okay, total number of unique events. Save as new. Okay, so that's sort of typically how I would sort of advise somebody to to start the building of a dashboard would be to start with some high-level metrics as like a spread of single value KPIs across the top, and then sort of work the detail further on as we go. So if we now think about the way that we'd want to do drill downs with the single value KPI information. So for instance, if I follow my same process of going 2012, what you'll see is that now all these KPIs react accordingly. So I've drilled down, I've selected 2012, dive into my 5th month, and all of these KPIs are refreshing as I'm going on the 15th day. And I might want to know, okay, this purchase requisition process, single click on that, and then that just filters, or double click, and then that then takes me into my detail again for that particular thing. But as I've now gone down this path, or this drill path, all these KPIs have refreshed accordingly to what I've been filtering on. So that's like that. And now also what I want to do is I might want to just add more traditional filters. Like I just want to select, for instance, a process group and just make it a little bit easier for me. What I can do is I can say, okay, cool. I've got 2 data models on my dashboard at the moment, process overview and process overview detail. I want to use process overview. I then want process group description to be a filter. And then I'm going to call this process group. And the different types of filters is I want it to be a suggest filter. So what that's going to do is it's going to add a pre-populated list of elements for me to choose from as a drop down. So I can say, okay, well, show me commodity management, air freight, and administrative. And then I can apply my filter, and then the dashboard reacts according to what I filtered. So this is like a more traditional way to interface with the dashboard, is you pick a list of filters, you get your scenario. But then one of the things you can do is that these filters can apply, but then you can also do your drill. So so what happens is that this filter scenario is unique to what's being applied there, as well as 2012 5th month and the day. So also what I mentioned in terms of the ability to stay at a particular drill level but remove the filters. If, for instance, I want to be at the process group description level in this particular chart, but I want to remove all the filters that I used to get there, I can now remove all of those sticky filters, and now what's happening here is that I'm at my process group description level, but I'm only filtered to what's being filtered over here. So essentially what I've done is I've drilled down to a particular point, but then I've removed the filters that got me to that point. So if I want to view a different level without those filters being applied, and then typically I can just add that normal filters, and that keeps me at that drill level, but it applies those different filters that I'm doing. So that's sort of a little bit more advanced. That you may or may not have seen. So let's go back home. Let's remove all these filters. And let's sort of get back to the base level. So that's basically a base level. Now I want to combine some different visualizations together. So let's go process instance ID, and let's go process group description. Let's make it a pie chart. Oops, I don't have year anymore in my order by. So let's make it a pie. So I'm going to say now number of events by process description. Save as new. Add it to my dashboard. My pie is now available for me to use. I've got my legend over here. Okay, so let's get a little bit more esoteric in the visualization type. So, so some of the things you can do is you can do like Sankey diagrams, network diagrams, word clouds, and sort of JavaScript maps and Google Maps and things like that. But what I'm going to do is just demonstrate one of the interesting things that we found, in particular, sort of with process-aware data, like a sand key might be pretty cool, where you might take an event description, pop it in there. Let's do a sand key. Let's just see how much data there actually is here. Sure, that's quite a lot of data, but let's keep that going, and then let's go originating user. So what a sand key allows you to do is to sort of link things together. So you might see, okay, this particular user deals with that particular process a lot, or these events are not unique to this particular process, but they might be across processes. So it's a nice way to see the link up between certain things. And then you can also see that link in a network diagram, which you probably have or haven't seen something like this before. But basically what's happening here is, let me just change the way that this is solving itself. So what's happening here is that it's basically linking all these process groups descriptions with the event description and the originating user. So for instance, if I want to now go in a little bit and see, okay, cool, well, air freight approval process, that seems like a bit of a standalone process. So the users that interact with that process don't tend to interact with other processes, but there's a clump of stuff that's all interrelated. So basically, if, these people literally interface with these other processes. So it looks a bit clunky now, but what we'll do is we'll add it to the dashboard and then see what's happening once we apply some filters. So let's call it process network. Let's add it to our dashboard. Okay, so let's actually now drill down as well. So let's see, okay, 2012, and my network diagram is going to sort itself out accordingly. In the 5th month, on the 15th day, for this purchase requisition process, what was all happening over here? So basically now I've got my different users spread across my different events that are interacting with this process. So this might be a little bit sort of not advanced or like a little bit different to what you've seen before. But once you sort of have a particular use case for this, it's a very nice way to visually see what's happening within a process or who's actually interfacing with that process.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite showy, whether it's immediately useful for a particular customer, maybe not. But let's then actually now go ahead and try embed this dashboard. So that's typically what you want to do. So what I've shown now is how you go ahead and you build this process, or you build this dashboard, but now you actually want to embed this into another application. So there's a couple of ways that you can do it. So one of the things that we do is that when the dashboard's created, we generate what we call a dashboard key, which is just one long encrypted string. And then we also provide a URL to actually point to that particular dashboard. Now, this is if you wanted to just publicly share this dashboard. Now, what I mean by public is that it's essentially unauthenticated. It's not like the public has access to this link, but it basically, if you had this link, you could basically take it and copy and paste it in a URL in a browser, and it's going to render itself inside of that environment. So that's basically the most simple and easiest way to embed, although there's a flaw in that if somebody's got this URL, they can actually access that information if they have it. The other alternative is that you actually use our embedded API, which is relatively simple to use. Basically, you go ahead and create an API key. That API key is then available for you to use and embed the particular dashboard. So for instance, if I wanted to now use this as an embedded link, what I'd do is I'd go, and we've got documentation around this as well, so don't stress if you're not sure what I'm typing. So you specify an API key, and then basically dashboard equals, and then that dashboard key, which is this this dashboard key over here. So that's as simple as creating an iframe in your application and essentially taking this URL. So if this API key then was working, basically it would authenticate you through and then render the dashboard exactly how this would be presented over here. So how this would look in terms of applying this in like a code scenario, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump you over to basically how this would work from an HTML perspective or an iframe perspective is that, traditionally you would, in an HTML world, is you'd create your iframe, and then you would basically close your iframe indicator like that, your tag, and then basically I'd save this, and then I'd call this index.html. And if I now go into centric index HTML source src, and then basically what I'd want, for instance, is my width equals let's go 600 pixels or something like that. Height equals 1200 pixels. Save that, and now let me just change the sharing settings on the. All right, so can you see my screen in terms of like what an embed sort of can look like? Obviously, this isn't. I can specify it a little bit bigger and things like that. Yeah. So that's typically what you do when you wanted to now render this your side. So I don't know, in your scenario, have you got like a little widget that you basically specify that it's an iframe, and then you just specify a source? It's almost like an object, and it's not sort of something custom coded. So that's a little bit about the embed. I've spoken about basically how you'd build a dashboard. There's a whole lot more options. I'll just quickly jump through a couple of the sort of more advanced options. So what you can do is build automations within OQLIS. So what that means is you might say, well, my average runtime for a process is an hour, and if the system periodically checks and the average process runtime is more than an hour, you can actually build automation rules that tell you, okay, I want to now trigger an event or do something or let somebody know that that threshold has just been breached. So basically, it's quite simple to set this up. You just say, give it a name and call it like a runtime exception. But you guys probably have similar things inside of your tool. But basically, you can say, well, okay, when total number of unique events is greater than a static value or a dynamic value of 100, then do something and check against this interval.
So have you guys got something then that you must be polling the data in the back end?
Exactly. So what we do is that we set up a schedule that sets that polling schedule. So for instance, I'm going to say, call this every hour. And then I can basically say, okay, cool, it's going to be daily, and it's going to repeat every sort of hour that I want it to do, something like that. And it's going to start at this day, and it's not going to end, whoops, and it's going to be in the South African time zone of 2+, Pretoria time zone 2+, Jerusalem, Johannesburg.
Yeah, it's probably a Rari or something there.
Yeah. Sarajevo, whatever. want to be in Tijuana. Yeah, so let's be in Jerusalem. Not that you'd want to be there right now. So basically, now that you've set up your schedule, you can link your automation to that schedule that would do your poll. So like say, call this event check. And then we say total number of unique events is greater than static value of 100. And I want to check every hour, save that. And now what you do is that because this is going to check against this criteria, you can set up automation action. So you can send somebody an email when that breach happens, or you can make an HTTP request. We've also recently added the ability to send an SMS and a WhatsApp and actually make a voice call, which is quite interesting. But basically, if you've got an API your side, you can build some automation rules, and basically we can post a request into your application and basically trigger another process or something like that, which would be quite interesting. And then also, yeah.
Sorry, Andrew, how resource intensive is this update? Because I know some other BMIs, they tend to run when there's no user activity happening on the sites because they're fairly resource intensive.
Yeah, so this is as resource intensive as the request that you calculating. So in other words, if total number of unique events, references a view, and that view is fast and it polls it every hour, that's the sum total of the intensity. It has to basically calculate that value every hour. So it's going to run that SQL query every hour. What you can do is build machine learning models inside of OQLIS that basically, say you want to build a regression model that calculates average completion time given certain characteristics. You can then basically let the model basically measure new records coming in and say, well, we estimate based on the model that this process should be finished within this amount of time. And then you can say, well, update the database, and then you can then poll the database with an automation and then trigger further action. So it sounds confusing when I explain it like that, but what we've done in the past is for a wind farm, there we sort of got hold of their data, and then basically what they wanted to know is the power that they produce. Obviously, it's relative to wind speed. So what we did is we built a regression model that estimates the amount of power that they'll produce given a certain wind speed. And we fed in the forecast of what the next 5 days look like in terms of wind speed and wind direction. And then we project using the machine learning model what they're expecting to produce. So what you can do in that scenario is that because now you've used your model to predict what you might produce, you can then measure that against actual values and then use an automation to compare actual values to sort of model values. So that's, I mean, it's a little bit more advanced, but those are some of the things you can do when everything's working lacquer. And that's one of the great ways to use the dashboards, the machine learning, the automation, the schedules, like all in one big sort of ideal process. That's one way to do it. But that's obviously a little bit more advanced, and a customer might just want a dashboard and they're not really interested in all these other funky elements. But those are some of the things you can do. Yeah, so I've sort of covered stuff in like a fair amount of detail. There's obviously like very, very nuanced settings for each thing, but probably the best thing that we can do following this session is create everybody a user that they can actually go ahead and experiment and create a couple of dashboards on this data and reference the videos and basically subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to get sort of notifications of new videos, and then basically then either have a follow-up session or answer any questions directly. But yeah, that's I don't know if there's anything else specifically, Dennis, that you wanted to cover, or anything more you want me to dive specifically into, but it's a lot of information.